She didn't ask for the keys. She told me to hand them over. That's the part people don't understand when I try to explain what happened. There's a difference between someone asking and someone telling. My son's wife didn't ask. She stood in the middle of my own backyard at the retirement party my family had organized for me, 70 guests watching, and she told me to hand over the keys to the lake house. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at her, and then I looked at my son standing just behind her left shoulder, and I said quietly, "No." That's when she grabbed my wrist. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer with the city of Ottawa. I have never in my adult life had another person grab me by the wrist in anger. Not a stranger, not a colleague, not anyone. She grabbed my wrist and she said, loud enough for the people nearest us to hear, "You are going to give us those keys tonight, or I promise you, you will regret it." My son looked at the grass. I want to start a few years back because this story doesn't make sense without context. And I've learned in the time since all of this happened that people who hear only the end of a story tend to assign blame in the wrong direction. My son. I'll call him my son throughout because that's what he is. Whatever else has happened, married his wife 4 years ago. I paid for the wedding, not partially, entirely. Her family is from Vancouver originally, and her father had been to a rough patch financially, a bad investment in commercial real estate right before the pandemic. He was a decent man, genuinely, and I never held that against him. When my son told me her family couldn't contribute to the wedding cost, I said fine. I covered the venue in Gatineau, the catering, the flowers, the photographer, the hotel block for out-of-town guests. The whole thing came to just under $40,000. I didn't say a word about it. Not to her family, not to anyone. It was my son's wedding. You do what you do. The trouble, I think, started when they moved in. After the wedding, the plan was always that they would live in the lake house in Calabogie for the first couple of years while they saved enough to buy something in the city. It's a 3-bedroom property I'd had for 15 years. My wife and I used it every summer, and after she passed in 2019, I kept it more out of habit than anything else. I wasn't using it full time. It made sense. What didn't make sense was what happened to temporary. A year became 2 years, 2 became 3. I started hearing through my son that his wife felt the commute to her job in Nepean was manageable, that they'd started thinking of Calabogie as home, that maybe they'd just stay, not buy anything, just stay, in my house. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to sound like a man who resented his son for needing help. I don't. I resented the assumption. There is a difference. When I raised the subject, gently over the phone, suggesting that maybe by spring they might want to start looking at properties, my son said he'd talk to her. He always said he'd talk to her. 3 weeks later, she called me directly. She said she felt I was trying to push them out. She said the lake house was their home now. She said, and this is the part I've thought about many times since, that I should think carefully about the kind of relationship I wanted to have with my future grandchildren. They didn't have children yet. It was a threat about a hypothetical. I kept my voice steady. I told her that the house was my property, that I appreciated them having lived there, and that I thought it was reasonable to begin a transition timeline. She hung up before I finished the sentence. My son called that evening. He said I had upset her. He said I needed to understand that she was sensitive about housing after her father's situation. He said maybe I could give them another year. I gave them another year. During that year, I noticed things. I'm not a suspicious person by nature. 31 years in municipal engineering teaches you to deal in evidence, not assumption. So when I say I noticed things, I mean I saw them clearly and chose, for a time, to give the benefit of the doubt. The joint account I had set up with my son, a holdover from when he was in university, which I'd never gotten around to closing, started showing withdrawals I didn't recognize. Small at first, a few $100s here and there, then larger, a patio set for the back deck, charged to the account. New appliances for the kitchen and the lake house. Over 14 months, a little over $9,000 that I had not approved and had not been told about. I didn't confront anyone. I called my bank and set up transaction alerts, and I opened a separate account and quietly stopped depositing into the joint one. I also, around this time, called my lawyer, not to do anything, just to have a conversation, just to understand what my options were as a property owner if I needed to formalize a request from my tenants, my son and daughter-in-law to vacate. My lawyer walked me through the process. We talked about the Residential Tenancies Act. We talked about my will, which at that time still listed the lake house as part of my son's inheritance. I didn't change anything. I just wanted to understand the landscape. The retirement party was my daughter's idea. I have a daughter, 2 years younger than my son, who lives in Toronto with her husband and my 2 grandchildren. She flew in with the kids for the weekend and she organized a backyard party at my house in Barrhaven, my primary residence, a modest split level I've owned since 1998. She ordered food from a Lebanese place my wife used to love, and she strung lights across the back fence, and she invited everyone I actually wanted to see. My son and his wife drove in from Calabugie. For the first 2 hours, everything was fine. I was talking to old colleagues, watching my grandchildren chase each other around the yard, eating kibbeh and feeling, genuinely, like a man who had built something worth retiring from. Then my son found me near the drink table and said his wife wanted to speak with me privately. I said I was at a party. He said she really wanted to speak with me now. I recognized the tone in his voice, the apologetic, slightly panicked tone that had become familiar over the past few years, and I set down my drink and followed him to the side of the house. She was waiting by the gate. She didn't lead with any pleasantries. She said that they had decided they weren't moving out of the lake house, that it was their home and they built a life there, and that what made the most sense was for me to transfer the deed. She said they'd been there long enough that they'd put their lives into that property. She said her husband, my son, agreed with her. She said it was time. I looked at my son. He looked at the gate latch. I said no. She said I was being selfish. She said the house was just sitting there, that I had another house, that they were my family. She said her parents had nothing and she wasn't going to let her children grow up insecure the way she had. I said that I understood she'd had a difficult experience, but that the house was mine and it wasn't going to change ownership. She reached out and grabbed my wrist. And then she said what she said about the keys. I want to be precise here. She wasn't asking me to hand over ownership in that moment. She was asking for the only spare key I kept at my Barrhaven house, a key to the lake house that I kept on a hook by my back door, the one she had seen me carry during a previous visit. She said that if I gave her that key, it would be a gesture of good faith, that we were working toward a transfer of the deed. I took my wrist back, quietly. I said, "You should go back to the party." She said, "You're going to regret this." What happened next is the part I replayed in my head for weeks afterward because it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. I walked back toward the party, found my daughter, and leaned down and said 4 words to her. "I need your help." She looked at my face and she knew. My daughter is perceptive that way. She took the kids inside under the pretense of getting them dessert, and I spent the next 45 minutes saying goodbye to guests like a man who was simply ready to call it an evening. My son and his wife left without saying goodbye. He texted me around midnight, "Dad, she's really upset. Can we talk tomorrow?" I turned off my phone. What happened in the following weeks was not impulsive. I want to be clear about that. I am not an impulsive person. What I did was methodical, because that's how I have always operated, and because I knew, with the kind of certainty that only comes from having been patient too long, that the situation had crossed a line it would not recover from. The joint account with my son had been dormant for 2 months already. I formally closed it the following Monday morning. The balance was mine. There was nothing in dispute. I contacted my financial advisor and restructured several investment accounts that my son had been informally aware of. Nothing illegal, nothing underhanded, simply removing assumptions that had calcified into expectations. He had grown up knowing roughly what I was worth. I'm not wealthy by Bay Street standards, but I'm comfortable, and he had spent years making plans based on a number that was never promised to him. I met with my lawyer on a Wednesday afternoon. We amended my will. The lake house would now pass, on my death, to a conservation land trust I had chosen, an organization that maintains wetland properties in eastern Ontario. The rest of my estate was restructured accordingly. My daughter was aware. She cried, not because she was gaining something, but because she understood what it meant that I was doing it. The formal notice to vacate, legally required under Ontario tenancy law, 60 days, hand-delivered by my lawyer's office, arrived at the lake house on a Thursday in October. My son called 4 times that day. I let them go to voicemail. On the 5th call, I answered. He said, "Dad, you can't do this." I said, "I've already done it." He said she was devastated. He said she was talking about calling a lawyer of her own. I told him that was her right and that he should remind her that they had been living in the property without a formal lease, without paying rent, and without any legal standing to contest a vacate notice from the property owner. I told him I had documentation of the $9,000 withdrawn from my account without authorization, and that if she wanted to involve lawyers, we could discuss that as well. There was a long silence. He said, "I don't understand who you've become." I said, "I'm the same person I have always been. You just stopped looking." He hung up. They moved out in December. My son's wife's brother helped with the truck. I know this because my daughter told me, and because I drove past the lake house that Saturday for no reason I'm particularly proud of. I sat in my car at the end of the road for about 10 minutes. It was a gray Ontario December. The lake was flat and the color of pewter, and the birch trees along the shoreline were bare. It was still a beautiful property. It will be for a long time. I spent Christmas with my daughter and her family in Toronto. We drove down the 401 on the 23rd, and I sat in the back seat between my 2 grandchildren, and we listened to them argue about what movie to watch on the iPad. My daughter's husband made tortilla from a recipe his grandmother had written on an index card sometime in the 1970s. We ate at a table that was too small for 5 people, and perfect for that reason. My son called on Christmas morning. I answered. We talked for 11 minutes. There was no apology. There was explanation. Her childhood, her anxiety about money, how much she had felt dismissed by me over the years. I listened. I said I understood some of it. I said understood some of it. I said understanding it did not change what she had done or what I had decided. He said, "So that's it? That's just it?" I said, "For now, yes. I don't know what comes next. I know there are people who will read this and think I was too hard. I know there are others who will say I should have acted sooner. Maybe both are right. I spent 63 years building something, a career, a property, a retirement, a relationship with a son I raised alone for the last 9 years after his mother died, and I was asked at my own party in front of my guests to hand it over. Not asked, told. My wrist still feels strange when I think about it. Not hurt, just remembered. The lake house is rented now to a young couple from Kingston who use it on weekends. They sent me a photo in April of the dock at sunrise. The water going pink, a coffee mug sitting on the railing. They take care of it. I can tell. I turned 64 last month. My daughter called at 7 in the morning, before the kids were up, just to talk. She said, "Dad, are you okay?" I told her I was. I told her the honest version of okay. Not perfect, not without grief, but okay in the way that matters. Steady. I still have the spare key on the hook by my back door. I don't know why I haven't moved it. Some things you keep, even after everything, just to remind yourself that it's still yours. I still think about that moment by the gate. The way she held my wrist. The way my son looked at the latch. There's something that happens when you've been patient for a very long time, patient past the point where most people would have acted, and then suddenly the moment arrives and everything becomes clear. Not angry clear, just clear. Like the lake on a still morning when you can see straight to the bottom. What I've come to understand, looking back at all of it, is that the story didn't start with Bridget grabbing my wrist. It started much earlier, with small choices I made about what I was willing to overlook. Every time I said, "I'll give it another year," I was teaching something. Every time I absorbed the withdrawal from the joint account without saying a word, I was teaching something, not intentionally, but consistently. And the people around me learned the lesson well, that there were no real edges to what I would accept. That's not a criticism of myself, it's just the truth as I see it now. Cause and consequence don't always arrive together. Sometimes they're years apart, and by the time the consequence shows up, you've almost forgotten what caused it. What I kept coming back to during those weeks after the party was a question my wife used to ask me when I was stressed about something at work. Did you do the right thing when it was hard, or only when it was easy? She had a way of cutting to it, doing the right thing when it cost you something, when it means disappointing someone you love, when it means standing in a side yard at your own retirement party and saying a quiet no. That's a different kind of decision than doing the right thing when it's convenient. I had spent a lot of years doing the easy version. At 63, I finally did the harder one. The intelligence part, and I don't mean book intelligence, I mean the kind of clear-eyed judgment that takes time to develop, was in not reacting in the moment. It would have been easy to lose my temper by that gate. It would have felt justified. But anger is only useful if it drives you somewhere specific. What I did instead was think. I went back to the party. I watched my grandchildren run across the lawn, and I started making a quiet list in my head of everything I needed to do and in what order. That list took weeks to work through. Every step was deliberate. That's the only kind of response that actually holds. And the last piece, the part that I think is the hardest for anyone to learn, not just me, is the willingness to follow through even when it hurts. Sending that vacate notice hurt. Hearing my son say, "I don't understand who you've become," hurt more than I expected. Spending Christmas without him at the table for the first time in 30 years, I won't pretend that was easy. Doing the right thing and the painful thing can be the same thing, and knowing that doesn't make the pain smaller, it just makes it bearable. Owen will have to make his own decisions about the kind of man he wants to be. I can't make those for him. Claire calls every Sunday. The grandchildren are growing fast. The key is still on the hook by the back door. I'm not sure I'll ever move it. Some things stay where they are, not because you've forgotten them, but because remembering is part of how you stay honest with yourself.